The first time Thomas walked into the community center on Oak Street, he almost turned around and left. The building was old and needed paint, but that wasn't what made him hesitate. It was the loud, booming voice coming from the main room, a woman's voice, harsh and cutting, making everyone around her shrink back. "If you don't like how I run things, then leave. No one's forcing you to stay." Thomas peeked around the corner and saw her. She was enormous, nearly 500 pounds, with her large body taking up most of a metal folding chair that looked ready to give out under her weight. Her face was red from yelling, and the volunteer she was shouting at looked ready to cry. "I just suggested we might try a different approach for the food drive," the volunteer mumbled. "Well, your suggestion is stupid," the large woman snapped. "We've always done it this way." People were staring at the floor, at the walls, anywhere but at the confrontation. Some whispered behind their hands. One man rolled his eyes and made a whale gesture behind her back. Thomas should have walked away. He had only come to get his community service hours for a work program. He could find another place, somewhere less uncomfortable. But something made him step forward instead. "Hi there, I'm Thomas. Today's my first day volunteering." The room went quiet. The woman turned to look at him, suspicion in her eyes. Up close, he could see they were a deep brown, almost amber in the fluorescent light. "Megan," she said finally, "I run the food bank. These people think I'm too tough, but I get results." Her chin lifted, daring him to disagree. "I'm sure you do," Thomas said simply. "Where do you need me to start?" That first day, Thomas watched Megan closely. Yes, she was loud. Yes, she was rude. But he also noticed how she knew every regular visitor to the food bank by name, how she slipped extra cereal boxes to the mothers with young children, how she made sure the elderly got help carrying their bags to the bus stop. When a little boy ran up and hugged her leg, Megan's whole face changed. For just a moment, the hardness melted away, and she patted his head with a gentleness that surprised Thomas. "Your mom doing better, kiddo?" she asked, her voice softer than Thomas had heard all day. "Yeah, she's back at work now," the boy said. "She told me to say thank you for the medicine money." Megan shrugged, the softness vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Tell her it's fine. Just pay it forward when she can." As weeks passed, Thomas kept returning to the center. He noticed how people avoided Megan, whispering about her weight, mocking her when they thought she couldn't hear. He saw how she ate alone during breaks, massive portions of fast food that she consumed quickly, almost shamefully. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked him one day, suspicion in her voice. "Most volunteers quit after dealing with me for a few weeks." Thomas thought about the question. Why did he keep coming back? It wasn't just the community service hours anymore. "I think you're interesting," he said honestly. Megan laughed, a harsh bark with no humor. "Interesting? That's a new one. Most people just call me the fat bitch who runs the food bank." "People can be cruel," Thomas said. "Tell me something I don't know." She took a massive bite of her burger, a defensive action rather than a hungry one. Later that day, Thomas overheard two other volunteers talking. "Can you believe how huge she is?" one whispered. "I heard she broke a toilet at her last job." "God, and that attitude. No wonder nobody wants to be around her." Thomas cleared his throat, and they jumped, looking embarrassed at being caught. That night, driving home, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about Megan, about the brief softness he'd glimpsed, about the careful way she helped the elderly, about the hurt that must lie beneath all that anger. The next day, against all logic, he brought 2 coffees to the center. "Black, 2 sugars," he said, placing one on Megan's desk. "I noticed that's how you take it." For a moment, surprise flickered across her face, surprise that someone had noticed something about her, something beyond her weight or her anger. "Thanks," she said gruffly, but her eyes held a question. Why? Thomas didn't have an answer yet. He just knew he wanted to see more of those rare, gentle moments hidden behind Megan's harsh exterior. That coffee Thomas brought Megan became a daily habit. Every morning, he'd arrive at the community center with 2 cups, black with 2 sugars for her, cream, and 1 sugar for himself. At first, she'd just nod and take the cup without a word. But after 2 weeks, she started saying thank you. After a month, she would actually look him in the eye when she said it. Small steps, Thomas thought, Small steps towards something, though he wasn't sure what. "Why aren't you always so nice to me?" Megan asked one rainy Tuesday. They were sorting donated cans in the back room, just the two of them. The rhythmic sound of rain hitting the metal roof made the space feel private, almost intimate. Thomas shrugged. "Why shouldn't I be?" Megan laughed, but it wasn't her usual harsh bark. It was softer, tinged with something that sounded like sadness. "Come on, look at me." She gestured at her massive body, the folding chair straining beneath her. "Look how I talk to people. I'm not exactly Miss Congeniality." Thomas kept sorting cans, giving her the space to talk without the pressure of his gaze. "I think there's more to you than what people see." Megan was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she might not respond. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "There used to be." They worked in silence for another hour. As they were finishing up, Megan pulled a chocolate bar from her pocket and unwrapped it with practiced movements. Thomas noticed how she turned slightly away, as if ashamed to be seen eating. "I wasn't always this big," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I was a normal kid. Maybe a little chubby, but nothing like this." She took a bite of chocolate, chewing slowly. "What happened?" Thomas asked gently. Megan stared at the half-eaten chocolate bar in her hand. "My parents split when I was 12. Dad left for his secretary, such a cliché, right? Mom fell apart, started drinking. Suddenly, I was taking care of her instead of the other way around." Thomas nodded, continuing to stack cans to keep the moment casual, to not make Megan feel like she was under a spotlight. "Food was the only thing that made me feel better," Megan continued. "When kids at school started making fun of my clothes because Mom couldn't be bothered to do laundry, I'd stop for chips on the way home. When Dad missed my birthday, I ate an entire cake by myself." She finished the chocolate bar and carefully folded the wrapper into a tiny square. "By high school, I was already the fat girl. And let me tell you, kids are cruel. They called me names, mooed when I walked down the hall. One boy asked me to the dance as a joke. His friends laughed for weeks." Thomas felt a surge of anger on behalf of that teenage girl, humiliated and alone. "I'm sorry that happened to you." Megan shrugged. "I figured out pretty quick that if I was mean first, if I was louder and tougher than everyone else, they'd leave me alone. They'd still hate me, but at least they'd be scared to say it to my face." And the weight kept piling on, Thomas guessed. "Yeah, the more people stared, the more I ate. The more I ate, the more people stared. Funny how that works." She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "By the time I hit 300 pounds, I'd given up on ever being normal again. By 400, I'd given up on anyone ever seeing past all this." She gestured at herself again. "The loss," Thomas said simply. Megan's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as if looking for the joke, the hidden insult. Finding none, her expression softened into something vulnerable that made her look younger. "Anyway," she said, clearing her throat, "that's why I run this place like I do. These people coming in for food, they're already humiliated having to ask for help. The least I can do is make sure they get what they need, make sure no one looks down on them." It clicked for Thomas then, Megan's fierceness toward the other volunteers, her protectiveness of the food bank visitors, especially the children. She wasn't just a bully. She was a guardian. As they finished for the day, Megan pulled on her oversized coat, struggling a bit to get her arms into the sleeves. Without thinking, Thomas stepped forward to help. She froze for a moment at his touch, then allowed him to hold the coat for her. "Thanks," she mumbled, not meeting his eyes. "See you tomorrow," Thomas said, "same time, same coffee." For the first time since he'd met her, Megan smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. "Yeah," she said. "I'd like that." Thomas wiped his sweaty palms on his pants for the 5th time in 10 minutes. The small velvet box in his pocket felt impossibly heavy. 2 years had passed since he first met Megan at the community center, 2 years of coffee and conversations, of slowly breaking through walls she'd built around herself. They sat on a bench in the park near the duck pond, the only bench sturdy enough to support Megan's weight without wobbling. It was their spot. They'd had their first real date here, sharing sandwiches and watching ducklings follow their mother across the water. "You're acting weird," Megan said, eyeing him suspiciously. "What's going on?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I've been thinking." "Dangerous hobby," she joked, but he could hear the nervousness underneath. Despite how far they'd come, Megan still expected bad news, still braced herself for rejection. "I love you," Thomas said simply. Megan's face softened. "I love you too. But you already told me that this morning, so what's really going on?" Thomas slid off the bench and awkwardly got down on one knee. Megan's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "Thomas, don't." He pulled out the small box and opened it, revealing a ring with a single modest diamond. "Megan, will you marry me?" She stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Nobody wants to marry someone like me." Her voice cracked. "Look at me, Thomas. I'm almost 500 pounds. I can barely fit through some doorways. People stare at us everywhere we go." "I don't care what people think," Thomas said. "I care about you." A tear slipped down Megan's cheek. "Your family will hate this. Your friends already think you're crazy for dating me." She wasn't wrong. When Thomas had first brought Megan to meet his parents, his mother had pulled him aside afterward. "Honey, I'm worried about you," she'd said. "That woman isn't healthy. What kind of life will you have?" His father had been more blunt. "Son, there are plenty of nice women out there who take care of themselves. Why pick one with such obvious problems?" Even his best friend, Dale, had joked, "Is this some kind of charity case? Or do you just like having a girlfriend who can't run away?" Thomas had stopped inviting Dale around after that. "My family will come around," Thomas said, still kneeling. "And if they don't, that's their loss. As for my friends, the real ones have stuck around. The ones who couldn't see what I see in you weren't real friends anyway." Megan looked down at the ring, then back at his face, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. "What do you see in me?" Thomas smiled. "I see someone brave enough to protect others even when no one protected her. Someone who secretly puts aside the best donations for the families who need them most. Someone who acts tough but cries at dog food commercials." Megan gave a watery laugh. "That commercial was sad, and you know it. I see all of you, Megan, not just your size, not just your tough exterior. I see the woman who taught herself to cook so she could make me dinner on my birthday. The woman who remembers how I like my coffee and makes sure it's ready before I wake up on Sundays." More tears fell down Megan's face, but she was smiling now. "You've seen me at my absolute worst, Thomas. I've yelled at you. I've pushed you away. I've eaten entire pizzas in front of you. And I'm still here," he said. "I'll always be here." Megan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You know people will talk. The wedding will be a circus. Then we'll have a small wedding, just us and whoever truly supports us." She looked at the ring again, her large hand trembling slightly. "What about children? I might not even be able to have them." "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Thomas said. "There are many ways to build a family." Megan took a deep breath. "You're sure about this? Really sure?" "More sure than I've been about anything." Slowly, almost as if she was afraid the ring might disappear, Megan held out her hand. Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit, just as the jeweler had promised when Thomas had special ordered it in her size. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Thomas rose to embrace her, he caught sight of people watching them, some smiling, others whispering behind their hands. He didn't care. All that mattered was the woman in his arms, finally believing she was worthy of love. The first year of marriage brought challenges Thomas hadn't fully expected. He'd known life with Megan would be different, but the reality was both harder and sweeter than he'd imagined. "I'm sorry," Megan said one evening as Thomas massaged her swollen ankles. The walk from the car to the restaurant had been too much for her, and they'd had to leave before their food arrived. "You should be out with friends, not stuck at home with me." Thomas continued rubbing her feet, working his thumbs into the sore spots he'd learned to find. "I'm exactly where I want to be." But sometimes, in private moments when Megan was asleep, Thomas admitted to himself that it was difficult. The stares when they went out in public. The way his mother still asked, "How are things?" In that concerned tone, clearly hoping he'd announce he'd come to his senses. The limitations on their activities. Last month they'd tried to go to the movies. Thomas had called ahead to make sure the theater had seats without armrests, but when they arrived, those seats were already taken. The look on Megan's face, A mixture of humiliation and resignation had broken his heart. "It's fine," she'd said. "Let's just go home and stream something." But it wasn't fine. Thomas knew how much Megan had been looking forward to seeing the movie on the big screen. Their house had required modifications too. Thomas had installed a sturdier toilet, a shower with a bench, doorways without thresholds that Megan might trip over. He bought special plates that didn't show fingerprints when Megan's hands got sweaty from the effort of eating, something she'd admitted embarrassed her deeply. "You regret it?" Megan asked one night, her voice small in the darkness of their bedroom. "Marrying me?" Thomas reached for her hand under the covers. "Never," he said, and meant it. Because for all the difficulties, there were moments of joy that made everything worthwhile. The way Megan's face lit up when she found a restaurant with booths she could fit in comfortably. The sound of her laughter, real laughter, not the defensive kind, when they watched comedies together at home. The warmth of her beside him each night, her body that others mocked but that Thomas found beautiful in its own way. But there was something Thomas couldn't ignore, no matter how much he wanted to. Megan's health was getting worse. "Your blood pressure is concerning," the doctor told her during a checkup. "And these blood sugar numbers indicate pre-diabetes. Mrs. Walker, I have to be honest with you. At your weight, you're at serious risk for heart disease, stroke, and diabetes complications." Megan had nodded, her face a mask. Later, in the car, she'd broken down. "I'm going to die young, and there's nothing I can do about it." "That's not true," Thomas said, reaching for her hand. "There are options, changes we can make." "I've tried dieting my whole life," Megan snapped, pulling her hand away. "It doesn't work. I lose 20 pounds, then gain back 30. What's the point?" They drove home in silence, the weight of the doctor's warnings hanging between them. That night, Thomas woke to find Megan's side of the bed empty. He found her in the kitchen, eating ice cream straight from the container. "I couldn't sleep," she said defensively. "Don't lecture me." Thomas pulled up a chair beside her. "I'm not here to lecture you. I'm just here." Megan's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Why do you put up with this? With me?" "Because I love you," Thomas said simply. "And because I want many more years with you." Tears welled in Megan's eyes. "What if I can't change? What if this is just who I am?" Thomas touched her cheek gently. "Then I'll love who you are. But Megan, I don't think you're happy like this. Not really." She looked down at the ice cream, then pushed it away slightly. "I'm scared," she admitted in a whisper. "Food is the only thing that's always been there for me. When I'm sad or stressed or angry or bored, food never judges me. Food never leaves." "Neither will I," Thomas promised. Megan looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing the truth of his words for the first time. "Okay," she said finally. Maybe we can look into some options. Not promises, just options." Thomas nodded, not wanting to push too hard. "One day at a time," he said, taking her hand in his. Outside their kitchen window, the first light of dawn was breaking. Thomas hoped it was the beginning of a new chapter for them, but he knew the road ahead would not be easy. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Thomas was in a meeting when his phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket. When he finally excused himself and checked it, his heart dropped. 6 missed calls from Megan's number, then 1 from the hospital. "Mr. Walker? Your wife has been brought to the emergency room. She's stable, but she experienced chest pains and difficulty breathing." Thomas drove to the hospital with his hands shaking on the wheel. 3 years into their marriage, he'd been expecting this call, dreading it. Megan had made small efforts to change her eating habits after the doctor's warning, but old patterns died hard. For every healthy meal she ate, there were late-night binges she thought Thomas didn't know about. For every short walk they took together, there were days when getting out of bed seemed too much for her. In the hospital waiting room, a nurse directed him to Megan's room. Thomas paused outside the door, taking a deep breath before entering. Megan looked small somehow, despite her size, surrounded by beeping machines and white sheets. "Hey," she said weakly. "Sorry about this." Thomas rushed to her side, taking her hand. "What happened?" "I was at the food bank, helping unload a donation. I felt this crushing pain in my chest, couldn't catch my breath." Her voice trembled. "I thought I was dying, Thomas." A doctor entered the room, clipboard in hand. He was young but had kind eyes that didn't judge as he looked at Megan. "Mrs. Walker, we've run some tests. You didn't have a heart attack, but you experienced something called angina, chest pain caused by reduced blood flow to your heart. It's a warning sign." Thomas squeezed Megan's hand tighter. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," the doctor continued. "At your current weight and with your blood pressure and cholesterol levels, you're at extremely high risk for a major cardiac event. Without significant lifestyle changes, I estimate you have a 75% chance of having a severe heart attack within the next 5 years." Megan's face crumpled. "So I am dying?" "No," the doctor said firmly. "Not yet, but this is your body's final warning." After the doctor left with instructions for follow-up appointments and medications, Megan turned her face to the wall. "You should go home, get some rest. I'll be fine here overnight." Thomas kissed her forehead. "I'll be back first thing tomorrow to take you home." The house felt empty without Megan's presence. Thomas wandered from room to room, feeling lost. In the kitchen, he opened the fridge out of habit and stared at the contents. So much food, most of it unhealthy. He began pulling items out: ice cream, cheese, processed meats, sugary drinks. He filled 3 garbage bags before he was done. Then he sat at the kitchen table and did something he hadn't allowed himself to do in all the years with Megan. He cried, deep, racking sobs that shook his body. He cried for the woman he loved who was slowly killing herself with food. He cried for the children they would probably never have. He cried for the trips they couldn't take, the experiences they couldn't share because of Megan's size and health. He cried for the future that was slipping away with every pound she gained, with every artery that hardened in her body. And he cried for himself, for the exhaustion of carrying both their burdens, for the loneliness of loving someone who didn't love herself enough to stay alive for him. When the tears finally stopped, Thomas felt hollow. He wandered to their bedroom and sat on Megan's side of the bed. Her nightstand drawer was partially open and something caught his eye. He pulled it open further and found a small worn notebook. Opening it, Thomas realized it was a journal. Megan's handwriting filled the pages. Against his better judgment, he began to read. "I saw the way that woman looked at Thomas today in the store. Pretty, normal-sized. The kind of wife he should have. I wonder how long before he realizes it too." Another entry. "Ate an entire pizza after Thomas went to sleep. Hate myself. Hate how food controls me. Hate how I'm ruining his life." And the most recent, dated just last week. "I love him too much to keep doing this to him. Something has to change. I have to change. I just don't know how." Thomas closed the journal, his chest tight with emotion. For 3 years, he'd been trying to save Megan. What he hadn't realized was how much she wanted to be saved, and how trapped she felt in her own body, her own habits. Looking around their bedroom, at the reinforced bed frame, the wider doorways, the chair in the corner that could support Megan's weight, Thomas made a decision. This couldn't continue. Not for his sake, and not for hers. Tomorrow, when he picked her up from the hospital, things would be different. They had to be. Thomas pulled into the hospital parking lot, rehearsing what he would say to Megan. He'd stayed up most of the night, thinking about her journal entries, about the doctor's warnings, about their future. He had a whole speech prepared. All of it flew out of his mind when he walked into Megan's hospital room and found her sitting up in bed, talking to a woman in a white coat. Not her doctor from yesterday, someone new. "Thomas," Megan said, her face lighting up. "This is Dr. Chen. She's a nutritionist." Thomas blinked in surprise as the nutritionist smiled and extended her hand. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Walker. Your wife and I were just discussing some first steps toward a healthier lifestyle." Thomas looked at Megan, who seemed different somehow. There was a spark in her eyes he hadn't seen in months. "I'll leave you two to talk," Dr. Chen said, handing Megan a folder. "Look over these meal plans, and I'll see you next week for our first session." After she left, Thomas sat on the edge of Megan's bed. "What's going on?" Megan took a deep breath. "I thought I was going to die yesterday," she said quietly. "Not someday, not in 5 years. Yesterday. And all I could think was that I didn't want to leave you." Her voice broke slightly. "I don't want to miss out on our life together because I can't stop eating." Thomas reached for her hand. "I was so scared when they called me." "I know. And I'm sorry." Megan squeezed his fingers. I found Dr. Chen's card on my breakfast tray this morning, like the universe was giving me a sign. So I called her. Just like that? Megan laughed, but it wasn't her usual bitter laugh. Not just like that. I've been thinking about it for a while. Remember that journal you gave me last Christmas? Thomas felt his face grow warm. Should he admit he'd read it? I've been writing in it, Megan continued, not noticing his discomfort. Working through some stuff. About food, about my size, about us. I've been wanting to change, but I was too scared to try and fail again. And now? Now I'm more scared of not trying. She looked down at their joined hands. Yesterday wasn't just a warning, it was a second chance. The nurse came in with discharge papers, interrupting their conversation. An hour later, they were in the car heading home. Thomas kept glancing at Megan, who was reading through the nutrition materials from Dr. Chen. So what's the plan? He asked. Small steps, Megan said. Dr. Chen says crash diets don't work for someone my size. It's about making sustainable changes. She looked over at him. I'm also going to start therapy. For the food stuff, but also, she hesitated. For the other stuff, the way I push people away. The way I get so angry sometimes. Thomas felt a surge of hope, but tried to temper it. They'd been here before, moments of determination that faded when reality set in. That sounds great, he said carefully. What can I do to help? Just don't give up on me, Megan said, her voice small. This isn't going to be quick or easy. I'll probably mess up a lot. I'm not going anywhere, Thomas promised. At home, Megan paused in the kitchen doorway. What happened here? Thomas followed her gaze. In his emotional state last night, he'd forgotten about the empty fridge and cabinets. Cleaned out some stuff. Megan walked slowly to the fridge and opened it. Instead of her usual snacks and sodas, there were fruits, vegetables, lean proteins. All the things she'd always said she'd eat someday. You did this for me? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. For us, Thomas corrected. The next few days were a roller coaster. Megan had moments of determination, sitting with Thomas to plan healthy meals and even trying a gentle chair exercise video. But there were also breakdowns, like when she discovered Thomas had missed a stash of chocolate in the pantry and ate it all in one sitting, then cried for an hour afterward. I can't do this, she sobbed. I'm too broken. Thomas sat beside her on the couch, not touching her because he knew that sometimes touch made her feel trapped. You're not broken, he said firmly. You're struggling. There's a difference. A week after the hospital, Megan had her first therapy session. Thomas drove her there and waited in the car, giving her privacy. When she came out, her eyes were red from crying, but she seemed lighter somehow. The therapist says I've been using food as a way to punish myself, she told him on the drive home. And to push people away before they can hurt me. Thomas nodded. He'd suspected as much. It's going to be a long road, Megan said, looking out the window. But I think I finally want to walk it. Thomas pulled his car into the driveway after a long day at work. The weight of his briefcase felt heavy in his hand as he trudged up the walkway to their modest two-bedroom house. 2 years had passed since Megan's health scare, and each day had brought its own battles and small victories. He opened the front door, the familiar creak welcoming him home. The house smelled different, fresh veggies and herbs instead of the fast food that once dominated their lives. But it wasn't just the smell that had changed. Megan stood in the kitchen doorway, smiling at him. She had lost 150 pounds since her hospital stay. Her face, once hidden behind layers of puffiness, now showed her cheekbones and the dimple on her left cheek that Thomas had only discovered a year ago. She still wasn't thin. Her frame remained large and imposing, but the difference was striking. I made that chicken dish you like, she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. The one with the lemon and those weird little capers. Thomas smiled, remembering how they had watched the cooking show together, Megan taking notes and insisting they try new recipes instead of ordering takeout. It had become their Sunday ritual, cooking together, making enough for weekday leftovers, finding joy in new flavors rather than comfort in old habits. Sounds perfect, he said, hanging up his coat. How was your meeting today? Megan's support group had become a cornerstone of her journey. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she met with others who understood the complex relationship between emotions and eating, between pain and food, between isolation and weight. Good. Really good, actually, she said, her voice steady. I shared about what happened at the grocery store. Thomas nodded, recalling how just last week a stranger had made a rude comment about Megan's size while they were shopping. 2 years ago, Megan would have either lashed out with cutting words or broken down in tears. Instead, she had looked the woman in the eye and said simply, "Your comment says more about you than it does about me." I'm proud of you, Thomas said, meaning it. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been nights of tears when the scale wouldn't budge, days of anger when old habits crept back, moments of fear that change wasn't possible. Megan's therapist had helped her see how her childhood pain had shaped her relationship with food and with others, how her bullying behavior stemmed from a desperate need to protect herself. As they sat down to dinner, Thomas noticed the new photos on their wall, Megan at her niece's wedding, both of them hiking at the state park, their trip to the beach where Megan had worn a swimsuit in public for the first time in decades. Small moments that represented enormous change. Dr. Chen says my blood pressure is normal now, Megan mentioned between bites. And my blood sugar is stable. Thomas reached across the table for her hand. Unlike in the past, Megan didn't pull away from his touch or deflect the moment with a sarcastic comment. She squeezed his fingers, had a wedding ring catching the light. Remember our first date? Thomas asked. At that coffee shop where the chairs were too small. Megan laughed, a real laugh, not the defensive bark she had once used. And I knocked over the table when I tried to get up. And I asked you out again anyway. You were either crazy or saw something no one else did, Megan said softly. Both? Thomas replied with a grin. Definitely both. Later, as they walked around the neighborhood, another new habit. Thomas reflected on their journey. Megan still had bad days. He still worried sometimes. The world hadn't magically become kind or understanding. But they had changed. Megan's hand found his as they rounded the corner toward home. The sunset painted the sky in pinks and oranges, and somewhere a neighbor's wind chimes sang in the gentle breeze. They weren't perfect, but they were real, two people who had seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay, to grow, to become better together than they had been apart.